absolute joy to welcome you to the second Science Network event of term. If you've not kind of interacted with me yet, I'm Emma. I head up the Science Network, and it's my absolute joy to introduce you to Dennis, who is going to be speaking for us this evening on the topic of, as a scientist, can I really take the miraculous claims of the Bible seriously? It might be that for you or for some of your friends, actually, this whole idea of the supernatural is like really quite a big barrier to belief. Or it could be that actually, as a Christian, you're just not quite sure, how do I weigh up a serious scientific view of the world with this whole kind of supernatural miracle thing? It's quite hard to like maybe balance the two. So hopefully this evening is going to help us deal with some of those miracle claims of the Bible, know what to do with them. And we'll have a kind of a talk for 40 minutes or so, then lots of time for Q&A. We'll be using Slido for Q&A. You might be familiar with it, that you've used at kind of different events. And I'm going to pop that Slido link in the chat now so that you can, through the talk, be submitting your questions. Oh, I left the S off of there, but yeah, through the whole time, feel free to keep submitting your questions as we go along. You might have noticed this meeting is being recorded. So if you don't mind your face being on a recording that some people might see, like, it's nice to see faces, so do leave your camera on. If actually you'd really rather not be on any kind of camera, then do turn it off. So before I hand over to Dennis, it'd be great to just get to know you a little bit. I'll put you on spotlight so we can see your face. Dennis is the Emeritus Director of the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion in Cambridge, which is only kind of 10 minutes away from where I am in Cambridge now. It's a great city to live in, highly recommend it. But Dennis, before you moved to the Faraday, you had a long career working in science. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got from being an undergrad, like lots of the guys here are now, to where you are today?
Yeah, thanks. Well, it's really good to be with you this afternoon. The journey was, I guess, quite a long one, so I could be really brief, but I had a real interest after doing biochemistry as an undergrad in studying the biochemistry of the brain. So I went off, there wasn't much neurochemistry going on at Oxford in those far off days, so I went off to the Institute of Psychiatry in London and did a PhD there on the biochemistry of the brain, neurochemistry. And then actually spent the next 15 years lecturing in universities in the Middle East. I had sensed my gap year a clear call from God to go and serve him elsewhere. And that's where I ended up in the Middle East, and then came back and had various jobs, and finally ended up here in Cambridge, where I was actually switched fields rather from neurochemistry over to molecular immunology. So sometimes happens if you stay around in science long enough, 40 years in my case, in the research community, then you can end up having different fields. So I've been involved in several different fields, which has been really good fun.
Great. So that's a bit about your kind of journey in science and your career. Can you share with us just briefly a little bit about how you came to faith yourself and how knowing Jesus has made a difference to your science?
Sure, yes. So I was raised actually in a Christian family, so both my parents were Christians, and then age 13, I went on a Christian camp, and discovered that there's only one way to be a Christian, that is you have to personally commit yourself to Christ and accept his forgiveness for your sins, which is what I did at the age of 13. So I was actually a Christian right through the rest of secondary school, and by the time I got to university. So the big difference, I mean, it's made a huge difference to my science, partly, in fact, as to where I do my science. So as I mentioned, I ended up doing science in the Middle East. I don't think I ever would have ended up there had it not been for being a Christian and believing that I should love my neighbor as I love myself. And also it's made a huge difference in terms of just seeking to understand God's creation, seeing my scientific research as a wonderful way in which we can understand God's creation better than we did before. So I've always seen my research as a way of exploring God's world, exploring his creation, helping us to understand it better, and then hopefully to apply it in useful kinds of ways.
Yeah, thanks. And kind of moving more specifically onto the topic of miracles, just before I hand over to you, would you say, has there been a time in your life when you've experienced something you might call a miracle?
As you'll see as we go along in a few moments, definitions of miracles can be complicated, can't they, and a little tricky. So I would be a little bit hesitant to call anything specifically a miracle. I have to say, though, I have had times in my life when I've had a very strong personal experience of God's presence with me and protection. In fact, I would say at one point of an angelic presence, not through seeing angels, but that very strong presence of protection. And just briefly to tell you, the context was when I was working out in Beirut in American University Hospital during the Civil War. In fact, I'm not a medic, by the way, but I was there to help set up the National Unit of Human Genetics. And I came over to England for a conference, and then things really got bad there, and there was a lot of kidnapping, and it was a crazy time really to go back to Beirut. But the reason I went back was quite simply my family were there in Beirut, so I had to go and join my family. And I remember landing in the airport, in Beirut airport, which was remarkably, it was still open, only open for another day. And then when I got there, it was pretty much deserted, and I just walked through. I booked a taxi ride with my very faithful Shiite Muslim taxi driver who knew the route very well. But the main road from the airport at that time we called Kidnap Alley, is where they were kidnapping Westerners and holding them. And I had a very strong sense of God's protection at that moment. And when I arrived, thank the Lord, there was the Shiite taxi driver, and he was already had his Kalashnikov in the boot, I'm sure, and stuff like that. And off we went. And I just mentioned that because of that very strong experience I had of God's protecting hand at that moment, which was actually quite dangerous.
Great. Well, I think we can't wait to hear more about what you've got to say on the topic of miracles and science. So I'm going to mute myself, hand over to you, Dennis, and the floor is yours for the next 40 minutes.
Right. So I am going to just share my slides, and there we are, hopefully. And let's see if we can get that's right, there we are. Okay, hopefully everyone can see the slides there, and if you can't, just give a shout. I'm very grateful for having the opportunity to share a bit about this very important subject. It's a long sort of title, isn't it? As a scientist, can I really take the miraculous claims of the Bible seriously? So I hope you already understood from what we've been saying so far is I do take the miraculous claims of the Bible very seriously. I don't think I can ever remember a time when I didn't really believe in the biblical miracles. It was maybe just partly having a Christian background and so forth. But ever since then, I haven't seen anything in my science that would make me particularly worry or be concerned about my belief in the biblical miracles. So I hope the reason for that will sort of become a bit clearer as we go along. And I suppose it might be worth mentioning also, of course, that there are a huge number of Christians in the scientific community today. Many of them are my friends right here in Cambridge, who certainly take the miraculous claims of the Bible seriously. And indeed, that's why they are Christians, because we are united by belief in the resurrection of Christ. Now, of course, we have a great variety of people in the scientific community who believe all kinds of different things. And I suppose we should have at least one quote from good old Richard Dawkins here. And so here's a quote from Richard Dawkins, just to show we have variation in the scientific community, who once wrote this, that the miracles spoken of in the Bible are all freely used for religious propaganda, and they are very effective with an audience of unsophisticates and children. Every one of these miracles amounts to a violation of the normal running of the natural world. Well, you probably won't be surprised to hear that I think there are a number of real problems with that particular set of claims there. And of course, one of the problems is that nearly all those very sophisticated scientists who founded the disciplines that we now practice in science certainly believed in miracles. And it doesn't matter if you're thinking about Robert Boyle or René Descartes or John Ray or Isaac Newton or Michael Faraday or James Clerk Maxwell, who is the founder of the Cavendish Laboratory of Physics here in Cambridge. And you could go on hundreds more examples. All of these people were very committed Christians, and they certainly believed in the miracles of the Bible. And so that's one thing I suppose one could say as an immediate response to what Dawkins is saying here. And I guess just thinking of the University of Cambridge, my own university, as I was mentioning, there are just so many people here right now in this university who certainly are committed to the belief in miracles. I can think of professor of experimental physics. I can think of I can think of the director of the Stephen Hawking Institute. I can think of a professor of geophysics. I can think of the master of Magdalen College, master of Darwin College, and so on. One could go on, but to claim that people who believe in miracles are in some way unsophisticates, I think doesn't really fit the data that we have. There are some other things there in Dawkins' understanding of miracles, which we'll come back to in a moment. But let me just quote here from somebody over in the States who is a leading Christian as well as a leading scientist, in response to a question that was asked him by the journalist John Horgan. And John asked him, as a scientist who looks for natural explanations of things and demands evidence, how can you also believe in miracles like the resurrection? And Francis Collins, who's director of the National Institutes of Health, there are 19 of them, by the way, responded in this way. I don't have a problem, he says, with the concept that miracles might occasionally occur at moments of great significance, where there is a message being transmitted to us by God Almighty. But as a scientist, I set my standards for miracles very high. And of course, Francis Collins is well known as someone who has a very committed trust and faith in Jesus Christ. Now, of course, we've already been thinking about the word miracle and its use in common speech. We saw some great quotes from you recently, a few moments ago. And we had this one at the top of the list there, a real miracle. I passed my exams, or in my case here in Cambridge, maybe somebody might say it's a real miracle I got into Cambridge, and so forth. Miracle rescue of a baby from earthquake rubble. The word miracle is just used all the time, isn't it? In daily lives, when we read the media and so forth. And generally it means something unusual or very unexpected. If you want to go to Wikipedia, then here's the definition. A miracle, quote, can be defined as a violation of natural law by a supernatural being. Now, as it happens, I don't think that's really the Christian definition of a miracle, although it's interesting that I think quite a lot of Christians would go along with that sort of definition. It's not that the definition of Wikipedia is irrelevant. It's certainly relevant, as we'll see in a moment, but it's certainly very incomplete, I think, as we think about the miracles as we understand them in the Bible. But before we get to the biblical understanding of miracles, let's see where Dawkins' understanding of miracles comes from, and where Wikipedia's understanding of miracles really comes from. We're going to do just a little bit of philosophy, gentle philosophy, for the next 5 minutes or so, just to see where all that comes from. And the place it comes from, or the person it comes from, is David Hume, very influential Scottish philosopher of the 18th century. And he wrote this essay called The Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, 1748. And it contains within it his short essay on miracles. It's short, but it has been extremely influential over the years since David Hume. And I want to give you just a couple of background points to Hume that might help you in understanding where he's coming from in this particular essay. The first point is that the idea of scientific laws has very deep theological roots. Hume would have known about these. You'll find the idea of scientific laws for the very first time in the writings of 17th century natural philosophers such as Descartes, Boyle, and Newton in particular. And of course, these, as I mentioned earlier, these were all committed theists. They were people who certainly believed in God as creator. And they reasoned that just as God had created moral laws that we need to obey, so therefore there must also be scientific laws that properties of matter have to obey as well in the same sort of way. And so these people were theists and not deists. They just believed that the miracles also provided strong evidence for the truths of Christian faith. But being deist then is relevant for the second background point, which we need to think about if we want to understand Hume. So as I say, in the 17th century and the 18th century in particular, the deistic thinkings were extremely influential. One of them was called John Toland, and he was perhaps the leader of the deistic thinkers. And they were distinctive from the Christian theists. They resisted the idea of a God who was active in human lives. Especially, they resisted the idea of a God who did miracles or answered prayer, that sort of thing. And so that's why when we get to David Hume, we find really he's just summarizing the arguments of those deists that were very popular in his time. And there, as I said, it's a small essay tucked away in the Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. And he's really trying there to strip away the whole idea of the supernatural, take it right out of Christianity, and just somehow keep to the morality without any of the doctrinal basis for that. So what does he do here? Well, in his essay, part one, his opening gambit is to sort of underline the point that experience is our only guide in reasoning concerning matters of fact. And as he said, his experience is not an infallible guide, as nature is not always predictable, and neither do we know all the possible range of natural causes. So, says Hume, a wise person, well, he said a wise man, proportions his belief to the evidence. So the observer, he said, should sort of balance the type of evidence which is available to them and establish a kind of certainty-uncertainty scale in which beliefs will vary in their position on the scale depending on the available data. And I think when we read that, we sort of say, yeah, that sounds pretty good. I personally don't see any particular problem with that way of approaching the data. But then Hume goes on to claim that if our experience of something is completely consistent, if A always goes along with B, then if someone claims something different, then we shouldn't believe it, however strong the evidence might be. And so famously, and this is the key quote here really to remember from Hume, he says, therefore, a miracle is a violation of the laws of nature, and as a firm and unalterable experience has established these laws, the proof against a miracle from the very nature of the fact is as entire as any argument from experience can possibly be imagined. And so you see what's going on here. Hume is trying to establish that in principle, no testimony, no evidence under any circumstances would be sufficient to establish the veracity of any miraculous event, simply because we've never seen such a thing before. And so his concept of law was actually quite different from the Christians of the 17th century. His idea of law of nature was something in which our own experience had established a regularity of a concurrence between events to such a high degree that not a single occasion had ever been observed when this concurrence was lacking. And you can see immediately that is very different, isn't it, from the ideas of laws of nature as seen by the Christian natural philosophers or scientists, because they saw the laws of nature as being rooted in the will of God and the faithfulness of God, who is the creator and lawgiver. Therefore, there was a kind of necessity built into that idea of law. It wasn't just that we observe certain things happening in the same kind of way, but also that there was a necessity in there. But just remember, let's just accept Hume's understanding of the laws of nature and see where that goes. And indeed, there have been a number of critiques that philosophers have mounted against Hume's essay on this point. First of all, if you think about it, the argument is circular. For if a miracle is a violation of the laws of nature by definition, which has in turn been established by unalterable experience, then clearly there can be, by prior definition, no experience that anyone could have which would change such a conclusion. You can see how it goes round and round. Miracles cannot happen by definition. And the problem with that, of course, is that it just closes your mind to the data, because there might be data that comes along that demonstrates that something very exceptional happens, but you wouldn't ever, your mind would be closed to the data in that case, because you simply wouldn't be able to believe it. Second, Hume's idea that a large accumulation of uniform human experience adds up to such a quantitative weight that no counter evidence can possibly overthrow it is really not a very useful one. Because, for example, even though nobody up until now has detected a single and ambiguous and intelligible message from outer space. But if you just got one, I think one would be enough, then this would establish the existence of intelligent life forms elsewhere in the universe. And so science thrives on the exceptions. Conformity to previous experience is pretty boring. If you want to first author paper in Nature, look for the exceptions. Let's say, for example, this morning, before 12 o'clock this morning, I said, it's impossible that we can make a good vaccine against coronavirus. Okay, well, you know, I'd just wait till 12 o'clock and one was announced, for which we are, of course, very thankful and wait for all the data from Pfizer. Anyway, that's another story, but makes a similar point. You just need one bit of counter evidence. And of course, for counter evidence and falsifiability, we have to go back to the philosopher of science, Karl Popper. And he was famous for making potential falsifiability a key criterion for a valid scientific theory. As Popper pointed out, however many times you look at white swans and you observe white swans, millions, you can count up millions and millions and millions of white swans, you can't really therefore infer all swans are white, because a single black swan, and there it is, your whole theory has collapsed. And your whole theory saying white swans are the only swans around is simply not the case. So, of course, Popper made this a criterion to try and distinguish between science and non-science, and that way of distinguishing science has been very influential down the years and still is, actually. And I guess Hume also failed to realize that the wise and intelligent person bases his or her beliefs on evidence rather than probability. Evidence is weighed, it's not simply added up. So evidence for repeatable phenomena is not necessarily greater than for events which happen only once. And then a third critique of Hume's ideas really comes out of his understanding of laws anyway. Actually, Hume is really in a weak position to argue that miracles are impossible because they violate the laws of nature, since, as I mentioned before, for Hume, his idea of laws implied no necessity. They were based on simply the uniformity of repeated observations. Swans are always white. And Hume could have accepted the 17th century Christian understanding of laws, but actually he chose not to. And there's great irony, I think, in this whole discussion, because in fact, scientists today, I think the great majority of scientists would hold to a 17th century view of scientific laws. They forget its theological roots in God as lawgiver. Unfortunately, they forget about that. But they certainly would see scientific laws as not simply based on our observation, but simply they would have some intrinsic hold upon the problems of matter would be described by laws in that way. In fact, if you listen to the late Professor Stephen Hawking, his idea of laws was actually much more 17th century. He said it would be completely consistent with all we know to say that there was a being who is responsible for the laws of physics. Stephen Hawking. Okay, so that's a little bit about Hume. If you want to have a bit more discussion about Hume, I do have a handout. It's a Faraday paper on miracles, which I'm sure Emma will be delighted to send you later on, but I'll mention it now in case you are interested in Hume. The Faraday paper is not just about Hume, but it has a bit more about Hume in there. I want to switch gears now. That's what a lot of people, Wikipedia thinks, and Dawkins thinks, a lot of my secular scientific colleagues would think about miracles. It simply means, you know, breaking the laws of nature, and that can't happen, so they can't happen. And that's it, end of story. Let's come to the Bible. The biblical understanding of the miraculous is really rather different, actually. I'm going to start with a definition as what I see as the way the Bible handles the word miracle and all the various words used, translated as miracle. I would see, or the Bible, I think, sees a miracle as a sign of God's special grace in a particular historical religious context. Of course, the word grace there is a theological word meaning God's unmerited love and favor. And so the biblical miracles then occur within a theistic matrix in which God is the creator and sustainer of all that exists. So on occasion then, God chooses to do things differently in order to display his special grace and favor in particular historical circumstances. And it's quite interesting, I think, just to look at all the different words which are translated as miracles or wonders in the Bible. And we're just going to do a couple of minutes on those because they're important actually for understanding how the Bible understands miracles. So you have the Greek word taras and its Hebrew equivalent mopeth, and those are translated normally as wonders. And then you have the Greek word dunamis, which is translated as acts of power or mighty works, demonstrating the power, the dunamis of God. That's, of course, the root of our word dynamite. So that's a good way of remembering the word. And then the third word, which is most critical of all in understanding how the Bible views miracles, is the Hebrew word ot and the Greek word semeion or sign. And as we'll see in a moment, that's used all over the place in both the Old and the New Testaments. We'll look at some examples of that in a moment. But semios is where we get the word, that's the root for the word, our own word, semiotics in use. So miracles then are only meaningful in a particular context as they point to something beyond the event itself. If you go back to the Old Testament plagues, in Exodus chapter 3 to 10, they're each described as ot, they're described as signs. God is giving a sign there to Moses and the people of Israel. When you go to John's Gospel, the word signs all over the place. The miracles of Jesus are described as signs and so forth. And so the intention of semeion is to reveal aspects of God's character, especially his power and his love. And semeion, the sign, will tell you more about the ethical end and purpose of a miracle. Now, they're not the only words, teros, dunamis, and semeion in Greek anyway, and they're not the only words used by the New Testament to refer to the miraculous, but they are the most commonly used, and they're frequently mentioned together actually in the same breath. And in the Old Testament equivalent, those Hebrew words are often again brought together to express this sort of collection of meanings. Nice example there, Deuteronomy chapter 29, verse 3. Moses says, as they look back, having come out of Egypt and crossed the Red Sea, the Sea of Reeds, with your own eyes you saw those great trials, those miraculous signs and great wonders. So there's a lot of nuance here, isn't there, in the biblical text. It's not just one word you can just use all the way through, but there are these different words, and you really need to use them all together to really get the full meaning of what miracles are about. And so when you come to, as I say, the New Testament, then you find semeion is all over the place as we want to understand the miracles of Jesus. And then when Peter, disciple of Christ, was proclaiming the gospel, the good news about Christ on the day of Pentecost, he proclaimed that Jesus of Nazareth was a man accredited by God to you by miracles, by dunamis, by wonders, taras, and signs, semeion, which God did among you through him, as you yourselves know. So that's a good example of communication in preaching. Peter wanted to make sure that people really understood, this historical context of the risen Christ and the kind of wonders that he had been doing and their meaning and so forth. And of course, we notice in this little summary here of the miracles of Jesus, these were all public events. These were things that many people witnessed. There was plenty of evidence around that they had happened. Everybody knew about them and so forth. Anyone could just check up on their veracity by talking to the eyewitnesses. But despite all that, and in addition to all that, it was really their inner meaning, their semeion, which was most important. So in the Bible, then, it's the context and the purpose of the miracle which draws most attention, the significant historical religious context. And that's in stark contrast, isn't it, to Hume's understanding of miracles as somehow these sort of isolated, funny anomalies which violate the laws of nature. In contrast, biblical miracles are made plausible by their coherence, by the way they fit into a particular picture or narrative or context. Now, what I like to do now is just to think about I'm going to take four examples of four quite distinctive type of miracles from the Bible, the Old and the New Testaments, just so we can fill in some of this theoretical stuff and see how this works out in practice. And I hope this will help us in thinking about the biblical miracles. Let's just go back to the people of Israel crossing the Sea of Reeds. The Sea of Reeds, yes, it's Yom Sop in Hebrew, which means the Sea of Reeds. And this is as they were escaping, of course, from Egypt. And this is really interesting because when we look at the text in Exodus chapter 14 and verse 21, there it is on the screen, what we read is as they were trapped, as they couldn't get over the Sea of Reeds, and the army of Egypt were right behind and chasing them, would certainly have massacred the whole lot. Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind, and he turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground. So in this case, and a few other cases in the Old Testament, the text itself describes how the miracle happened. I mean, this has got nothing to do with the breaking of the laws of nature, but rather clearly this is a miracle of timing. It's a sign of God's grace in a particular historical circumstance, an answered prayer where the people of God were just trapped and there was only one way out, and that was to cross the Sea of Reeds. Now we could talk a lot about this particular miracle. I recommend The Miracles of Exodus by Colin Humphreys, who until recently was Professor of Material Science here in Cambridge. And more recently, he's gone to be a professor at Queen Mary College in London. His book, The Miracles of Exodus, give a really fascinating research account of how he thinks this crossing of the Sea of Reeds might have happened, and to see why he thinks it's just right here at the top of the Gulf of Aqaba, which is the top of the Red Sea. Then there's lots of evidence for that, which I found pretty persuasive, I have to say. But if you want the evidence, you'll have to read his book. But as Professor Humphreys points out, just to come now to the immediate context of our theme of miracles, you can perform a very simple experiment relevant to the crossing of the Sea of Reeds, which you just need this glass of water, which is very full with water, as you can see. And just throw it to fill it up to the brim, blow hard from one side, and you'll see the water just being pushed over and piling up on one side, and indeed probably spilling over the side of the glass. Now, the point here is you can see that same phenomenon when wind blows across lakes. Probably the most famous lake of all where it happens big time is Lake Erie in the States, one of these great lakes in the United States. And in fact, when there was one big wind blowing right across the lake, at one point historically, they measured a difference in the height of the water of the lake of 16 feet from one end of the lake to another, which is really quite remarkable. That's a very dramatic example of a wind tide or a wind set down. And as Professor Humphreys points out, a wind from the east, by the way, in Hebrew, they don't distinguish between, they don't have things like northeast or southeast. It's just north, southeast, or west. So, but anyway, if the wind was funneling down the Gulf of Aqaba, straight down here, and there's mountains, by the way, on either side, so it really is a funnel. The suggestion is, therefore, that the people of Israel crossed the Sea of Reeds right up here at the top of the Gulf as a result of a wind tide or wind set down. And then when the wind dropped, as the people of the Egyptian army here were following up, and that's when they got flooded as the sea roared back again and covered them in the bog up there at the end. Anyway, we can go into a lot of detail on that, but the point is really, the main point here is that the Bible sometimes does give you a clear explanation of how the miracle happened, and it's clearly a miracle of timing in this case. Second example I'd like to give is something very different. Okay, this is the first miracle of Jesus at a wedding in Cana in Galilee, as described for us in John chapter 2, where, as you remember, Jesus changes water into wine. Well, clearly this is a miracle with a big semyon, a big sign. And well, what is the sign here? Clearly what's going on here in the very first miracle, remember, that Christ did, it's symbolizing this inauguration of this new era in which Christ is to save his people from their sins. And he's obviously going to save them through the shedding of his blood upon the cross. So there's a transition there from water, the old covenant, to wine, the new covenant. And of course, Holy Communion today is that service of remembrance in churches in which Christians participate in drinking wine, which symbolizes Christ's death on the cross for our sin. But also here, of course, this is a miracle which also demonstrates Jesus' complete control over his creation. This is not like the Exodus miracles where the mechanism is explained for us, and that's surely precisely the point. Here we have Jesus, the Son of God, through whom John's Gospel tells us all things have been made, exerting his control over his creation. So the miracle is set within a matrix, within an understanding that Christ is truly who he claimed to be, the Son of God, inaugurating this wonderful new covenant. Now, for our third example, let's just take one of Jesus's many healing miracles, the opening of the eyes of the man born blind that we read about in John chapter 9. Now, you remember the story perhaps where the disciples sort of assumed that it must be due to sin. Here's this poor guy, been blind from birth, must be because of his sin. And so they ask Jesus in verse 2 of chapter 9 of John, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? By the way, never quite understood that bit about him. They knew that he'd been blind from birth, I guess, or maybe they didn't know. It seems like they would have known that. So it's not quite clear why they thought it would have been his sin that somehow caused his blindness from birth. But anyway, let's let that pass. What's really important, of course, is John's clear answer. Neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus, but this happened so that the work of God might be displayed in his life. And now let's come to what Jesus did. This is so interesting, isn't it? So verse 6, having said this, Jesus spits on the ground. He made some mud with the saliva and put it on the man's eyes. And then he says, go, wash in the pool of Siloam. This word means sent. And so the man went and washed and came home seeing. Now, there are many points of interest here in this account, which we don't have time for, but I guess the first question that probably comes to your mind, or comes to anybody's mind really, is why did Jesus do this? Why did he anoint the man's eyes with a mixture of saliva and mud? It sounds pretty mucky, doesn't it? And the answer is sort of immediately simple. This was a well-known medical treatment which was widespread at the time, and indeed in the ancient world. And you can read exactly the same therapy in ancient Chinese medicine. It was all over the world at this time. And if you are biologists, you'll know that saliva contains some nice enzymes, amylase enzymes that break down carbohydrates. It contains also some lipids, lipases that break down lipids and so on. Probably, it was quite useful biologically if your eyes, a kid, let's say a child, had eyes full of crud, full of, excuse the expression, full of food or something like that, and then they needed to cover them and then to wash them and so forth. Now, clearly, that's not relevant really as a medical therapy, is it, for someone whose eyes were blind from birth? That's not going to really help. And so, I think probably most commentators would say what's going on here is Jesus is simply wanting to encourage the man's faith, because he had to take a step of faith. After that, he had to go off to the pool of Siloam. He had to wash his eyes, and then his eyes were miraculously opened and healed. So there was a lot going on here. But first of all, Jesus wanted to see the man's faith tested and grown and so forth. But also, there's lots of other things going on here. And if you go back to John chapter 8, the chapter before here, you'll see that there's a big sign going on here. There's a big semeion, because Jesus has just proclaimed in the previous chapter, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. And so often what you find in the Gospels is you find teaching, the miracle, amplifying, explaining, helping to illustrate the teaching, back to teaching, more miracles, and so forth. You've got this sort of intercalation between teaching and miracles going on, and I find that extremely striking and very helpful. Of course, in the present case with this poor guy and John chapter 9, you may remember that he actually knew, of course, he knew the evidence for himself. His eyes were opened, and his parents knew the evidence extremely well, and so did everybody else. They all knew that his eyes had been opened miraculously and he told the Pharisees that, and in the end they didn't want to hear. They just chucked him out. So I think sometimes when there's a lot of evidence for miracles, people just go, they just don't want to hear. They block their ears and they want to kick it out. Because the implications are pretty remarkable, aren't they? Because clearly someone who could do that, as this man said, Jesus is Lord. Only someone who was the Lord over the whole of creation could do something like that. Okay, and speaking of which, let's take the fourth miracle, which is, of course, the greatest miracle of all in the whole New Testament, without which we could not be a Christian. The resurrection of Christ, absolutely central to Christian faith, by far the most important miracle recorded in the Bible for us. Huge amount of evidence for the resurrection. I'm not going to go into all that at the moment, but here I just want to draw your attention in particular to the semiotics, if you like, of the meaning of the resurrection, because it demonstrates Christ's power over sin and death. It demonstrates the power of sin was unable to hold Christ in the tomb, therefore his death on the cross was truly victorious. It means that Christ is alive today and that we can come to know Christ personally for ourselves. It means that there really is life after death. And certainly for myself, of course, having experienced the risen Christ since I became a Christian a few years ago now, at the age of 13, I won't say how many, it's really a wonderful experience to know Christ as that living person, that living Lord over our lives that we can talk to and communicate with day by day. But just a couple of things before I wrap up and before we have some question time. Clearly from these four examples of biblical miracles, we shouldn't think that all accounts of miracles have potential scientific explanations. Many just don't, do they? I mean, everybody knows that water doesn't suddenly change into wine. Everybody knows that dead people don't rise from the dead and so forth. They knew that just as well in the first century as we do now. So it's not that science has changed anything, really. I mean, it doesn't really make it more or less likely they happened. It's a question of believing the people who witnessed those particular remarkable events. And despite these great biblical miracles we've just been thinking about, it's good to remember that the Bible isn't just chock-a-block with miracles, but rather you find them in two great peaks located there at the Exodus, associated with Moses in particular, and then, as we've just been thinking, in the life and ministry of Christ and the early church. And there are large areas, large parts of the Bible where really there aren't many miracles going on. In fact, you could place the biblical miracles on a kind of spectrum with respect also to the possibility of their scientific explanations. At one end, you've got these miracles. We gave an example, the crossing of the Sea of Reeds, which have a sort of natural explanation that's provided for us by the text itself. And then you've got up the other end the miracles with no particular natural explanations. So just to summarize then, how are the biblical miracles different from the understanding of miracles with Hume and Dawkins? First of all, as we've been seeing, they're set within this matrix of belief in God as creator and sustainer of all that exists. And second, it's the meaning of the miracles that is the key. Miracles are signs of God's grace in particular historical circumstances. And third, the biblical miracles clearly lie beyond science. They belong more to history, although clearly both history and science are interested in evidence. And so we're down here, aren't we, again, to eyewitnesses. And it's true, I think, to say that all of history is about the study of unique events. I mean, no historical event is exactly the same as another. They might be similar, but at the end of the day in history, it's really the evidence that counts. And that's why the early followers of Christ made much of the evidence of the resurrection. It's seeing Christ alive, many of them in one group. As one time as many as 500 of the disciples saw Christ alive following his resurrection. And so what science and history do have in common is their commitment to the importance of evidence. I also find it fascinating, as we were referring to earlier, Karl Popper and his idea of falsifiability. That pops up actually in the writings of the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 15. He's writing about resurrection there. And he says quite clearly, well, if Christ hasn't been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. He's saying, well, if Christ isn't risen, let's eat and drink, and for tomorrow we die. I often thought this, this is about AD 54. It's only about 20 years so just after the resurrection had happened. It was a time when, had the body of Christ been embalmed and was sitting in some grave in Jerusalem waiting to be discovered, had it been discovered at the time, the whole of Paul's faith would have been refuted just in one case, just in one example like that. So I've just thought many times how striking it is. Of course, the body wasn't found. Why? Because Christ had risen. The body wasn't there. But Paul really believed that because he himself had encountered the risen Christ on the road to Damascus. But here he says, here's something falsifiable. If Christ has not been raised, well, we're wasting our time, and let's all go home. And so, what a wonderful example of falsifiability that we have in principle in the New Testament. So we obviously are not in the same position as the Apostle Paul in that way, with possible potential access to the data. But we can enter into the empirical thought processes, I think, of those first century disciples. So evidence and potential falsifiability really do matter. And I think miracles can be really good, and they can be really true. And I hope those brief thoughts have stimulated you for some questions. So I'll just leave you with a few other links there you might be interested in. Thank you for your attention.
Great. Dennis, thank you so much. We're going to have a little bit of time for questions and answers now. I'm just going to send that link to Slido again, I think, for a couple of people who joined a bit later and might have missed it. But we've got some questions beginning to come through. You can also upvote other people's questions on Slido. So if you head over there and maybe you've not asked something, but you see a question that you really want answered, click on the kind of like button and you'll be able to upvote it. So we'll answer those ones at the top first. So we've got a few on there so far. First question, Dennis, very simple. How do we know if something is a miracle or not?
Right. Well, can I ask, well, I don't know if we can clarify the question. Depends if you're talking about biblical miracles or if you're talking about miracles today. I think the question is probably about miracles today, but let's just think about the biblical miracles. How can we clarify it? I think because the text makes quite clear what it thinks about these special events. It calls the miracles one of the many words that we have just been thinking about. In terms of how do we understand miracles today, I think, as we've seen, I think it depends on the context. So I think the question to ask about it, is this a sign of God's special grace to someone in a particular point of need or a particular point in their lives, maybe when they need some help? Let's imagine, for example, that there is an elderly lady who's got rheumatoid arthritis, and she's really crippled, and she is in great pain. And despite the many medications, sadly, they haven't really worked for her. And on it goes. And then she just feels, as we read in James, that she should get the prayer of the elders from her local church. And so she goes to a local church and she asks for them to anoint her with oil and to pray for her and to pray for her healing. And by the way, her medical records are very clear. Her medical records show quite clearly, she's had this drug and that drug and this pain relief help and so forth, and they really haven't worked very well. And then she gets prayed for, and then a day later, she goes to sleep that night and she wakes up and rheumatoid arthritis is gone. And let's say a year goes by and she's looked at by a number of medics who are pretty amazed, and they decide that, yeah, she's remarkably been healed. We don't really understand that, but there we go. That's what happened. They are the witnesses. So it's the medics who are the witnesses. Now, I wouldn't have any hesitation in calling that a miracle. And I see no reason why God can't perform a miracle in someone's life in that way if God chooses to do so. Now, of course, you do get a theological stream which says, and you find this in a number of theologians down the centuries, that somehow miracles stopped at the end of the New Testament. That's it, at the end of the ministry of Christ in the early church. But I can't see any evidence for that personally in the New Testament. I'm personally a scientist who's pretty skeptical about things, like Francis Collins said. My bar is pretty high. But if there's something like that lady, I'd say, well, praise the Lord for God working in that person's life and healing them. Now, I've taken an easy example. that was an easy example, I think. Okay, and I agree there are sort of foggy examples between, you know, some remarkable answer to prayer or something that really amazing happened. To be honest, you know, if you feel as a Christian, you feel God has done a miracle in that way, I don't think we should just spend a long time discussing the terminology and the labeling. You know, just be thankful. God has done a wonderful, great thing in your life. Like I gave the example of just a sort of sense to me anyway of real angelic presence in landing in Beirut in the middle of a civil war when it was really dangerous and being delivered from kidnapping at that time. Well, would I call it a miracle? I don't think so. I don't worry about that. I just think, you know, God is gracious sometimes in helping us in difficult circumstances, and it doesn't always happen that way. And we all know that Christians have accidents. We all know that Christians can have bad things and so forth. You know, so I think we had to be a little bit careful about getting too bogged down in wanting to strictly label it. Okay. And maybe not use the terminology too frequently. I think if we overuse it, then it sort of can evacuate the word of its strength and meaning that we find in the biblical text.
Sure. Okay. So next question, honing on in kind of particularly on the biblical miracles. How can we be sure that the miracles written about in the Gospels, in particular, actually happened when they were well-known literary devices in mythical texts at the time?
Well, the first thing to notice is they weren't really that well known in the way that Christ carried out the miracles. Now, there were other people who at the time who were claiming to do miracles and claiming to do this and that, and of course some of them were rebelling against the power of the Roman Empire at that time and its whole. As you remember, Palestine was an occupied territory at that time. It was occupied by Roman soldiers, and they were in control. So there were a number of radical movements going on whereby they were trying to overthrow the political power of Rome, and they were suppressed pretty radically. But I think it'd be really hard to find examples of miracle workers in texts of the time that were like that. So I would come back and say, well, let me know what particular texts they are. Now, if you go to the 2nd century, you'll find a number of the Gnostic writers will invent miracles that they think Jesus has done, and so forth. You will find plenty of literature like that. But you know, they're 2nd century. I mean, it's not that hard to make the, you know, you've got the so-called Gospel of Thomas and other Gospels that are not written by eyewitnesses, clearly, of what Christ had done. So I think the key thing is to realize that the Gospels are very well authenticated in terms of textual origin, also very well clearly set within their particular historical context. And also the number of witnesses, the number of people who actually saw the miracles at that time. So I think that's what I would, as a scientist, you know, I would take that as more important evidence, I think, than somebody writing some literary composition, which sometimes, as I say, was clearly located in the 2nd century.
Great. If anyone wants to come back on that with a kind of clarification, feel free to send that in the chat or on Slido, or unmute and add something.
Emma, can I just add one little point there?
Mm-hmm.
You might, I mean, if you're really interested in that area, here there's Professor Simon Gathercole in the Faculty of Divinity, who is an expert on the 2nd century Gnostic writings, who's written quite a lot about this. And there's another book written by another Cambridge person called Peter Williams, who's written a book called Can We Trust the Gospels, which again goes into those questions in more detail. I would recommend Peter Williams' book in particular as an introduction on that topic. Thank you.
Yeah, Can We Trust the Gospels is excellent if you haven't read it. I think I read it in one sitting. It's not hard. It's, really, really great introduction. On that kind of same topic, this is such an important question someone's asked. Where would you start if someone asked you for the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus?
So where I would start, I think, is actually just saying, well, to be honest, the way you look at the evidence is going to be very influenced by your worldview. Your starting worldview is going to influence how you look at that evidence. For example, if you start out, you are a firm atheist, you are more like, you know, Hume, you've never seen, obviously, a resurrection, and neither have I. And so if you start out with a worldview that doesn't believe in a God who is in charge of things. So therefore, the claims of Jesus to be, the Son of God, to be, I am my Father in one, I am the light of the world. You don't believe that because you don't believe in God the Father and the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. So therefore, I think that would be very influential in the way that you come to the evidence. Now, there are some people who do come to the evidence with that kind of worldview, and they become sufficiently convinced that they end up believing in the resurrection. And there have been, in fact, one or two famous cases of lawyers, a guy called Morrison, who was a lawyer who was skeptical, set out to show and write a book about how it was obviously clear that, the evidence of the resurrection was very feeble, and then ended up actually becoming a Christian. He became very convinced by the evidence, okay? So, but that's unusual, I think. And I think those who at least open to the idea of a God who has created life and everything in the universe, a God as a creator, I think would be more open, therefore, probably to at least the possibility that God can raise the dead, that God has power over death and so forth, and especially through his son, Jesus Christ. So I give that as the first point, okay? Because the question was, where do we start? Well, I think we might want to start with worldviews and how that influences our assessment of evidence. So, for example, if you're a Holocaust denier, I just take that as an example, and there are some Holocaust deniers around, including one or two rather famous historians, believe it or not. Then whatever evidence is going to come your way, no, it can't possibly be true. So that's a kind of Hume approach to the whole thing, isn't it? It can't be true because it's not true. Secular, kind of a secular argument. But if you can get past that, sort of situation, to really having a bit of an open mind and being willing to look at the evidence, then of course there's a whole slew of amazing things. Of course, there's an empty tomb. I mean, you have a lot of witnesses. You have written records. You have people who saw the risen Christ. You have an empty tomb. There is no pilgrimage to a tomb in Jerusalem, unlike almost every other religious leader in the world that you can imagine. There's always a tomb that people have gone pilgrimage to go and visit. We don't have that in Christian faith. Why? Because the tomb was empty. Okay, there's no point visiting an empty tomb. And then there's certain details that you find in the description where the first disciples who ran to the empty tomb on that first Easter morning, and they looked inside, and then they saw the cloths lying in the place where the body had been, and yet no body. Okay, so there were still undisturbed cloths. It wasn't that the body had been stolen, despite a rumor being spread around that was the case. And then, of course, if the body had been stolen, well, the easy way to counteract the rise of Christian faith was simply to produce the body. Okay, let's see the body. Where is it? And that would have quickly been a counterfactual. That would have quickly falsified the resurrection of Christ. And then, of course, we come to the argument of Paul that I was using, that it would have been so easy at the time to falsify the idea of the risen Christ. Just show us the body, embalmed, wrapped up and well embalmed, quite recognizable by his family, still alive, by his disciples, still alive, and so forth. So that's the sort of direction I would go in, I think, in considering the evidence of the resurrection of Christ. One could go on a lot longer, but I won't. Okay.
Yeah, sure. A couple more questions here. We'll stick with the miracles theme for a minute, and there's one that might be good to ask, which is something different. But could you address the claim that biblical miracles are simply a mixture of highly improbable happenings plus exaggerations, i.e., no supernatural involvement?
Well, clearly, I mean, if you were simply in a context where you didn't know all the other things that were going on, you would be much more likely to think that, wouldn't you? I mean, for example, it's quite possible that there have been east wind has blown probably a number of times down the Gulf of Aqaba, if we want to accept that particular interpretation. So what makes it unique, and it was unique, what makes it unique is you've got the people of Israel who are needing to get across, they've got the Egyptian army behind them and so forth. So the uniqueness of the event is not the east wind blowing, it's not the water piling up in a certain kind of way, so that it allows them to cross over before the water piles back in again. No, the uniqueness is the particular historical circumstance. And it's the same with the empty tomb, isn't it? I mean, there were loads of empty tombs in Jerusalem at the time of Jesus, his death, but the key point here is it was that particular tomb that was empty. It was that particular stone that was rolled away. So I think the key thing to remember here is these are not anomalous events, that randomly happen in some random way, which, wouldn't be particularly interesting, perhaps, but these are historical events set in a particular context, and that's what makes them meaningful. That's what makes them biblical miracles, actually, because they are a sign to something deeper going on inside. So that's how I would put that, I think. And just to follow up with that, remembering that most of the people listening to Christ were completely skeptical. I mean, okay, the disciples were chosen and followed him very early in his ministry, but most of the people didn't believe. They were skeptical, and the Pharisees and the Sadducees, I mean, they thought he was talking rubbish. So then suddenly these skeptics were faced with miracles like the man whose eyes have been opened. So, whoa, okay, what are you going to do? Over to you, Emma.
Okay. Someone is asking a follow-up question to a previous answer that you gave, saying there are two worldview leaps that people have to make: naturalism to deism, and then deism to theism. Which is more important? I wonder. Part of that question is that a two-part journey: naturalism to deism, deism to theism? If so, what's kind of the most important leap in that journey for someone?
Right. So by naturalism, I'm taking it, you would mean by that the worldview which says that all explanations are natural explanations. There is nothing outside of what we can see and touch and feel in the material world. Because there are different definitions of naturalism. So yeah, how do you get from that to deism? Well, I'm not sure that actually leaping to deism is necessarily the most rational leap to make, actually. And that's quite a long discussion there. But so because if there is a God who is upholding and sustaining the whole of the universe and is actively involved in that universe, which is what theism is about, then to me anyway, it's much more rational to believe that as a scientist when I simply study the properties of the world in which I live. So if you're believing in a naturalistic philosophy, you just have to say, well, the universe is the way it is, and we really don't know why. So you have to accept that the universe is intelligible, that we can understand it through science, that we can write wonderful equations that describe the properties of matter. You have to accept that. You have to believe in scientific laws, but you don't know where they come from. And so really the universe ends up being a really big puzzle, because there's no, okay, sure, we can describe it by 6 numbers if you're Martin Rees and that sort of thing, but still that in a sense raises much bigger questions as why does that kind of universe exist, and why is it intelligible in that particular way? And why do we really believe an electron on this side of the universe behaves in the same way, as far as we know, as an electron on the other side of the universe? Okay, we can describe it through scientific laws and so forth and so on. So when you start sitting down and thinking about this very remarkable universe in which we live, it seems to me that theism is a much more rational explanation for the existence of that kind of entity. And that's where I would go from naturalism to theism. Because if there is a God like that, I think it's quite hard to believe it's a God who is intimately involved in sustaining and upholding Schrodinger's equation, and upholding the properties of matter and everything that exists, including my own body. Then that seems to me to be a God who would just be rational to believe in a God who might do things differently sometime, or a God who's answering prayer, a God who's interested in us, and so on. So I would go in that direction, I think. I don't see deism necessarily as some kind of bridge between naturalism and theism. It might be for some people, but not for me.
Yeah, helpful. Okay, one final question, which is on a slightly different topic. What opportunities did you have to share the gospel when you were working as a scientist in the Middle East? If it would help your kind of answer this, I can edit this part out of a recording if there's kind of sensitive things that you wouldn't share kind of on a recorded call. But
see how we go. Well, I could spend a long time on this one, but I won't spend a long time. Yeah, I mean, there were loads of opportunities, and in daily life, just friendship with people, and of course, dialoguing with Muslim friends and so forth, um, helping people to understand what Christian faith is about in daily life, and of course, in parts of the world like Turkey and so forth, there's very little understanding of what Christian faith is about. You know that. And every single Turkish school child will tell you, you know, that all the Gospels, that they had hundreds of them at the beginning, they were all contradictory. And then at the Council of Nicaea, which is in Turkey, by the way, Iznik, they had a big bonfire in about 325 AD, when they just burned all the Gospels except the ones that we have today. Every Turkish school child will be able to tell you that kind of story. So a lot of it is ground clearing, is trying to explain, you know, just to explain what actually happened, what the Council of Nicaea was really about. There's a lot of mutants around. There's hundreds and hundreds of mutations. And so that those prevent people from really understanding what the good news of Christ is all about. Other times in the American University Hospital in Beirut, in the middle of the Civil War, I had a Bible study group meeting in my office. There were a whole bunch of Christians, medics at the hospital at that time, and they had a wonderful time reading and studying the Bible. The bombs were dropping outside. It was pretty noisy, and all kinds of wounded were being brought there, but they were off duty at that moment, and they came around and studied the Bible right there in the hospital. So, you know, yeah, I could go on. I mean, there's plenty of openness, plenty of opportunity to share your faith when you're in different countries and different circumstances. And sometimes when life is especially tough, like during a war, you know, then it's more open. Let me just, I won't go on too long, Emma, but let me just tell you one example. In our church in Beirut, I remember a lady from Druze. You may not know the Druze. That's one of the sects, Shiite sects that came out of Shiite Islam and settled in Lebanon way back in the 12th century. Anyway, there was a lady from that background, Druze background, and she'd become a Christian. And I remember asking her one day, how come she became a Christian from that kind of background? And she just looked at me and she said, well, she said, in my religion that I used to be in, there's no forgiveness. There's no basis. There's no way we can forgive people. And the Lebanese Civil War was all about that. And an inability to be able to forgive others from different groups and sects that had done bad things to you and so forth. And she said that, and I started reading about the life of Christ, and then I found out about forgiveness, and that's what really touched my heart. And the Holy Spirit used that to bring me to faith in Christ.
Great. Thanks so much, Dennis. That's all we've got time for on the questions for the time being. But yeah, we're so appreciative that you've given up a lot of your Monday evening to come and speak to us on the subject. I'm sure we can all kind of, by the reactions or on your screen, show our appreciation with some clapping hands. But yeah, we're really grateful.
Thank you. Thanks for the great questions. Oh, good. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure, like, as you guys have seen, this has all been recorded and will be hopefully going up on the Science Network website, hopefully by the end of this week, if not early next week. And so if there's anything you've heard this evening, you think, actually, I've got a mate who would really appreciate hearing some of those arguments, then do share the recording with them, and, you know, maybe chat it through afterwards. One thing that I'm going to be doing over the next few weeks is reading this book that Dennis has just published called Are We Slaves to Our Genes?, which is exploring some of the themes of kind of genetic determinism. Are we really just nature plus nurture and nothing more? Or is free will really a valuable category to talk about? I've just got my hands on a copy. I'm really excited to start reading it. And if that's a topic that anyone is thinking about, interested in, and actually you think, oh yeah, I've got a bit of free time during lockdown, I'm quite up for reading something, they're chatting about it. I'd love for anyone to talk this through with when I finish reading it. So do bear that in mind. The next thing we've got coming up for everyone in Science Network is another online event on the 7th December on the title, Is My Faith Just a Byproduct of Evolution? That's such a key question, isn't it? When we, particularly if you're studying biology, Where does kind of religious faith come from? Is it something that does have an evolutionary component? Does it not? Is that a problem, or is that okay? So we've got a speaker called Justin Barrett, who's going to be zooming in from the US to come and speak to us on that topic. Do keep that date in your diary, 7th of December, and let other people know about it. You can see I've just shared in the chat the Faraday paper that Dennis mentioned that he's written on miracles. So if you want to kind of keep reading on this topic a bit, that would be a great place to go. And as ever, keep an eye on the Facebook group for all the information about upcoming events, blog posts, everything we've got going on. You can always get hold of me at science@uccf.org.uk, or you're all in the Facebook group. You can see that I'm posting on there all the time. Just drop me a message about anything, any questions, feedback. Yeah, I'm always happy to receive those kind of messages. So yeah, thanks so much for coming, everyone. I hope you have a great rest of your Monday evening, and see you around soon, hopefully.